Empires rise and fall. Paper remembers them all. A Man and His Dream. The year is 105 CE in the heart of the Han Dynasty, one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. In the grand palace of Emperor He, surrounded by marble pillars and golden ornaments, a man named Cai Lun stands before a table covered with strange materials. His hands are stained with plant fibers, tree bark, and water. He is tired. His back aches from hours of standing, mixing, pressing, and waiting. But in his hands, he holds something that will change the world forever. It is a sheet of paper, not silk, which only the wealthy can afford. Not bamboo strips, which are heavy and clumsy. Not clay tablets that crack and crumble. This is something new, something soft, something that can be rolled, folded, written upon with ease. Something that anyone, in theory, could make. Cai Lun does not know it yet, but he holds in his hands the future of human civilization. Let us go back to the beginning of his story. Let us understand the world before paper, so we can truly appreciate what this invention would mean. Cai Lun was born around the year 50 CE in Guiyang, a region in what is now Hunan province in southern China. We do not know much about his childhood. Historical records from this period are sparse when it comes to the early lives of common people, and Cai Lun began as a commoner. What we do know is that at some point in his youth, he was castrated and entered the imperial palace as a eunuch. This was not uncommon in ancient China. Eunuchs served the emperor and his family, and some rose to positions of considerable power and influence. Cai Lun was intelligent and ambitious. He learned to read and write, which was a privilege in itself. In his time, literacy was rare. Books existed, but they were cumbersome things. Imagine trying to read a letter written on strips of bamboo, each character carved carefully into the wood, the strips then tied together with string to form a scroll. A simple letter might weigh several pounds. A book could require a cart to transport. The Chinese had been writing for over 1,000 years by Cai Lun's time. They had developed one of the world's most sophisticated writing systems, with thousands of characters representing words and ideas. But the medium on which they wrote was a problem. Bamboo was the most common material. It grew abundantly in China, and it could be split into thin strips that were relatively smooth. But bamboo was heavy and bulky. A scholar's library might fill an entire room with scrolls that, in modern terms, would contain just a few books' worth of text. There was silk, of course. Silk was light and smooth, perfect for writing. The Chinese had been producing silk for millennia, and it was one of their most valuable exports. But silk was expensive. Only the wealthy could afford to write on silk. It was a luxury item, traded along the Silk Road to Rome and Persia, where it was worth its weight in gold. So the Chinese, for all their advanced civilization, for all their philosophy and poetry and government records, were trapped by the weight of their own words. Cai Lun saw this problem every day. As a eunuch in the imperial palace, he worked closely with the emperor and his officials. He saw the mountains of bamboo scrolls that recorded tax records, legal decisions, military orders, and diplomatic correspondence. He saw how difficult it was to organize and store these records. He saw how expensive it was to produce documents on silk. And he began to think, there must be a better way. But before we continue with Cai Lun's story, we need to acknowledge something important. Cai Lun did not invent paper from nothing. He improved upon an idea that had been around for at least 200 years. Archaeological discoveries have shown that the Chinese were making a primitive form of paper as early as the 2nd century BCE during the Western Han Dynasty, more than 2 centuries before Cai Lun. These early papers were made from hemp fibers and plant materials, but they were crude and inconsistent. They were not strong enough for writing, and they were not produced in large quantities. Some scholars believe these early papers were used for wrapping or padding rather than writing. What Cai Lun did was refine the process. He experimented with different materials and different techniques. He was methodical and patient. Based on what we know from historical records written shortly after his time, he tested combinations of tree bark, hemp, old rags, and fishing nets. He soaked these materials in water until they broke down into a pulp. Then he beat the pulp until the fibers separated. He mixed the pulp with water to create a thin suspension, then spread it onto a flat screen made of bamboo strips or cloth. The water drained through the screen, leaving behind a thin mat of fibers. When dried, this mat became a sheet of paper. The process sounds simple when described this way, but it required countless trials and errors. The ratio of water to pulp had to be just right. The screen had to be fine enough to catch the fibers, but coarse enough to let water drain quickly. The drawing process had to be controlled to prevent the paper from warping or tearing, but Cai Lun succeeded. In the year 105 CE, he presented his invention to Emperor He. The emperor was impressed. Here was a material that was cheaper than silk, lighter than bamboo, and could be produced in large quantities. The emperor ordered that Cai Lun's method be recorded and shared throughout the empire. Cai Lun was promoted. He became wealthy and respected. For a eunuch who had started as a commoner, this was an extraordinary achievement. The Chinese court recognized that this invention was valuable, though they could not have imagined just how valuable it would prove to be. For the next several decades, paper production spread slowly through China. Paper mills were established near rivers and streams, where water was abundant and could power the machinery needed to beat the pulp. The Chinese government used paper for official documents. Scholars began to write on paper instead of bamboo. Slowly, literacy began to increase, because the cost of writing materials decreased. But this was just the beginning. Paper's journey was just starting. It would take centuries for this invention to spread beyond China's borders. And when it did, it would transform every civilization it touched. Part 2. The Secret Art. For centuries after Cai Lun's innovation, papermaking remained a closely guarded Chinese secret. The Chinese understood the strategic value of their invention. Paper gave them an advantage in administration, communication, and culture. They could maintain more detailed records than their neighbors. They could spread information more efficiently. They could educate more people at lower cost. So they kept the process secret, much as they had kept the secret of silk production for centuries before. But secrets, especially useful ones, have a way of escaping. By the 3rd century, CE paper had spread to Korea, which was heavily influenced by Chinese culture and frequently sent scholars and diplomats to the Chinese court. These visitors learned about paper and brought the knowledge back home. Korean papermakers adapted the Chinese techniques, sometimes using different local materials. Korean paper, or hanji as it became known, developed its own distinct qualities. It was often thicker and more durable than Chinese paper, made from the inner bark of mulberry trees. From Korea, papermaking knowledge spread to Japan around the year 610 CE. A Korean Buddhist monk named Donsho is traditionally credited with bringing papermaking to Japan, along with Buddhist scriptures and teachings. The Japanese embraced paper enthusiastically. They refined the process further, creating washi, a paper known for its strength and longevity. Japanese papermakers discovered that fibers from certain plants, when processed correctly, could create paper that lasted for centuries without yellowing or deteriorating. The Japanese also discovered artistic uses for paper. They began creating decorative papers with embedded flowers, leaves, and colored fibers. They developed origami, the art of paper folding. Paper became integrated into Japanese culture in ways that went beyond simple writing. Paper also spread westward from China, but more slowly. The Silk Road, That ancient network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean carried many things: silk, spices, jade, glass, and ideas. But paper was heavy relative to its value, and transporting it in bulk across thousands of miles of desert and mountain was impractical. What traveled instead was knowledge. Traders and travelers who visited China saw paper and learned, in general terms, how it was made. But the specific techniques, the precise ratios and methods, remained elusive. This could imply that the Chinese papermakers were careful about whom they taught. Or it might simply mean that papermaking required hands-on experience that could not be easily conveyed through conversation. By the 7th century, CE paper had reached Samarkand, a major city in Central Asia along the Silk Road. Samarkand was a cosmopolitan place where Chinese, Persian, Arab, and Indian merchants mixed and exchanged goods and ideas. It was there, in that cultural crossroads, that papermaking would take its next great leap. The traditional story of how papermaking reached the Islamic world is dramatic and involves a battle. In the year 751 CE, Arab forces from the Abbasid Caliphate clashed with Chinese forces from the Tang dynasty at the Battle of Talas, near the Talas River in present-day Kyrgyzstan. The Arabs won the battle, and among the Chinese prisoners taken were skilled papermakers. According to the traditional account, these Chinese prisoners taught the Arabs how to make paper, and paper mills were soon established in Samarkand. This story has been repeated in countless histories of paper. It is dramatic and memorable, but modern historians are somewhat skeptical about the details. Based on what we know from archaeological evidence and early Islamic texts, paper was probably already known in Central Asia and the early Islamic world before the Battle of Talas. Chinese traders had been visiting Central Asian cities for centuries, and knowledge likely leaked out gradually, rather than suddenly, through captured prisoners. What the Battle of Talas may have done is accelerate the spread of papermaking knowledge and skills. Having Chinese papermakers in Samarkand, whether as prisoners or as traders who had settled there earlier, would have allowed local craftsmen to learn the fine details of the process. Within a few decades, Samarkand became famous for its paper production. Travelers from across the Islamic world praised Samarkand paper for its quality and smoothness. From Samarkand, papermaking spread rapidly through the Islamic world. This was a time of great expansion and cultural flowering. The Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled from the mid-8th to the mid-13th century, stretched from Spain to Central Asia. It was one of the largest empires in history, and it was characterized by remarkable intellectual and cultural achievements. Paper arrived at exactly the right moment. Part 3. The Islamic Golden Age. Imagine Baghdad in the year 850 CE. The city is magnificent, one of the largest in the world, with perhaps 500,000 inhabitants. The Tigris River flows through its center, and on its banks stand palaces, mosques, markets, and gardens. The Caliph rules from a great palace complex, but power in this empire is not just military. It is intellectual. The Abbasid caliphs, particularly Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun, were patrons of learning. They established a great institution called the House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, which served as a library, translation center, and academy. Scholars from across the empire and beyond were invited to Baghdad. They brought texts in Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac. These texts were translated into Arabic, preserving ancient knowledge and making it accessible to a new generation. And all of this scholarship, all of this translation and commentary and original work, was recorded on paper. Before paper became widely available in the Islamic world, scholars had to make do with parchment, made from animal skins, or papyrus, made from Egyptian reeds. Parchment was expensive and required killing animals, which made it slow to produce. Papyrus was fragile and did not work well in humid climates. neither could be produced in the quantities needed to support a massive scholarly enterprise. Paper changed everything. It was cheaper than parchment, more durable than papyrus, and could be produced in large quantities. A paper mill could produce in a month what might take years to produce in parchment. This economic change had profound cultural effects. Books became more common. Personal libraries became possible. Scholars could take notes freely without worrying about wasting expensive materials. Students could have their own copies of texts, rather than having to share a single manuscript among dozens of learners. The impact on science and mathematics was particularly dramatic. Islamic scholars made tremendous advances in algebra, trigonometry, optics, medicine, and astronomy. They built on Greek, Indian, and Persian foundations, and then went far beyond them. And they wrote it all down. They wrote commentaries and critiques. They wrote original treatises. They wrote practical manuals for engineers and physicians. They corresponded with one another across vast distances, sharing ideas and building on each other's work. Consider the mathematician al-Khwarizmi, who worked in Baghdad in the 9th century. His books on algebra and Hindu-Arabic numerals were translated into Latin centuries later and became foundational texts for European mathematics. Those books existed in multiple copies because paper made it possible to produce and disseminate them. Consider Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, who lived in Persia in the 10th and 11th centuries. He wrote the Canon of Medicine, a massive encyclopedia that became the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Europe for centuries. The canon runs to over 1 million words. It could not have been written or widely copied and distributed without paper. Consider Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Hazan, who conducted experiments in optics and wrote extensively about the nature of light and vision. His scientific method, which emphasized observation and experimentation, was recorded in detailed papers that influenced European scientists centuries later. The list goes on and on. Historians estimate that more books were produced in the Islamic world between the 9th and 13th centuries than in the entire previous history of humanity. This is not hyperbole. The availability of cheap paper created an explosion of writing, and that writing preserved and advanced human knowledge in countless fields. But paper's influence went beyond scholarship. It changed the nature of government and commerce. The Abbasid administration used paper for everything: tax records, census data, military orders, diplomatic correspondence, land deeds, and legal contracts. The bureaucracy became more efficient and more detailed. A governor in distant Spain could receive written instructions from Baghdad. A merchant in Cairo could have a written contract with a supplier in Persia. Paper also changed personal life. People wrote letters to family and friends. They wrote poetry and stories. They kept diaries and account books. Literacy increased, not dramatically but noticeably, because writing materials were no longer prohibitively expensive. And slowly, paper continued its journey westward. Part 4. Paper crosses to Europe. Paper reached the western edge of the Islamic world in the 10th century. By the year 1000 CE, there were paper mills in Morocco and in Spain, particularly in the cities controlled by the Moors, the Muslim rulers of the Iberian Peninsula. Christian Europe, at this time, was largely ignorant of paper. Europeans wrote on parchment, which they had been using since the fall of the Roman Empire. Parchment was expensive but durable. Great monasteries had scriptoria, where monks spent their lives copying religious texts by hand. A single Bible might take a year or more to produce. Books were rare and precious. Most people never saw a book in their entire lives. But along the borders between Christian and Muslim territories in Spain, there was contact and exchange. Christian merchants traded with Muslim merchants. Christian scholars visited Muslim libraries. and slowly, knowledge of paper began to seep into Christian Europe. The first paper to reach Christian Europe probably came as imported sheets from Muslim Spain or North Africa. Europeans were skeptical at first. Paper seemed flimsy compared to the thick parchment they were used to. There were also religious concerns. Some Christians believed that paper, because it came from Muslim lands, was somehow impure or unsuitable for holy texts. But economics gradually overcame these concerns. As trade increased and as European kingdoms became more administratively sophisticated, the demand for writing materials grew. Parchment production could not keep up. A single sheet of parchment required the skin of one calf, sheep, or goat. As Europe's population grew and as literacy slowly increased, the demand for animal skins became unsustainable. Paper offered a solution. By the 12th century, Europeans were not just importing paper, they were learning to make it themselves. The first paper mill in Christian Europe was established in Spain around the year 1150, in the town of Extiva, near Valencia. Extiva was in a region that had been under Muslim rule until recently, and the paper mill was likely built by craftsmen who had learned the technique from Moorish papermakers. From Spain, the knowledge spread to southern France and then to Italy. Italy became the papermaking center of Europe. By the year 1275, there were several major paper mills in the city of Fabriano, in central Italy. Italian papermakers were skilled and innovative. They introduced several important improvements to the papermaking process. One innovation was the watermark. Italian papermakers began embedding wire designs into their paper molds. When paper dried on these molds, the design would be visible when the paper was held up to light. Watermarks served as a trademark, identifying the mill that produced the paper. They also helped prevent forgery, as each mill's watermark was unique. This could imply that paper fraud was already a concern, suggesting that paper had become valuable enough that counterfeit documents were a problem. Another Italian innovation was the use of animal glue to coat paper. This sizing made the paper less absorbent and more suitable for certain types of ink. It also made paper stronger and more durable. Italian paper became famous throughout Europe for its quality. Merchants exported it to France, Germany, England, and beyond. As paper became more available, its price dropped. And as the price dropped, demand increased. By the 14th century, paper was common throughout Europe. It had not completely replaced parchment, especially for important legal and religious documents, but it was widely used for everyday purposes. Letters, business records, personal notes, and drafts of literary works. Universities, which were growing in number and size, used paper extensively. Students could afford to buy paper and take notes. Professors could distribute written lectures. This increased the efficiency of education and allowed knowledge to spread more quickly. But Europe was still constrained by one major limitation. Every book, every document, every page had to be written by hand. Copying was slow and error-prone. A single book might take months to copy. And with each copying, new errors crept in. The price of books remained high, and literacy remained limited. What Europe needed was a way to produce identical copies of texts quickly and efficiently. What Europe needed was the printing press. And in the middle of the 15th century, a German goldsmith would provide it. Part 5. The Gutenberg Revolution. Johann Gutenberg was born around the year 14 in the city of Mainz, in what is now Germany. His family was involved in the metalworking trade, and Gutenberg learned the skills of a goldsmith, how to work with metal, how to create molds, how to cast objects with precision. These skills would prove crucial to his greatest achievement. The idea of printing was not new. The Chinese had invented woodblock printing in the 7th century, and by Gutenberg's time, woodblock printed books and images were common in Asia. Some European printers had experimented with woodblock printing, particularly for religious images and playing cards. But woodblock printing had limitations. Each page required carving a new block, which was time-consuming. The blocks wore out quickly, and if a mistake was found, the entire block had to be recarved. Gutenberg had a better idea: movable type. Instead of carving entire pages, why not create individual letters that could be arranged and rearranged to form any text? The Chinese had actually invented movable type in the 11th century, but it had not become widespread, possibly because Chinese writing requires thousands of different characters, making movable type less practical than in Europe, where the alphabet has only a few dozen letters. Gutenberg spent years developing his system. He had to solve multiple technical problems. He needed to create metal type that was durable and precise. Each letter had to be exactly the same height so that they would print evenly. He needed to develop an ink that would stick to metal and transfer cleanly to paper. He needed to design a press that could apply even pressure to the type and paper. For the type, Gutenberg created a hand mold that allowed him to cast individual letters in lead alloy. The process was similar to techniques used in making coins and jewelry, but with much tighter tolerances. Each letter was cast on a small metal block, and the blocks could be arranged in rows to form lines of text. When a page was printed, the type could be disassembled and reused for the next page. For the ink, Gutenberg developed an oil-based formula that was thicker than the water-based inks used for handwriting. This ink adhered well to metal and transferred cleanly to paper. For the press itself, Gutenberg adapted the design of wine presses, which were common in his region. A large screw mechanism could apply tremendous, even pressure, pressing the paper against the inked type. By the year 1450, Gutenberg had a working system. He began printing, experimenting with different texts to perfect his technique. And then he embarked on his masterpiece, a complete printed Bible. The Gutenberg Bible, also known as the 42-line Bible, because most pages have 42 lines of text, was completed around 1455. It was a massive undertaking. The Bible was printed in 2 volumes and totaled around 1,300 pages. Gutenberg printed approximately 180 copies, of which about 135 were on paper and 45 on parchment. Each copy required careful work. After printing, the pages were often hand-colored and illuminated by artists, making each Bible somewhat unique. The Gutenberg Bible was beautiful. Gutenberg wanted his printed book to rival the finest hand-copied manuscripts, and he largely succeeded. The type was clear and elegant. The layout was carefully designed. To the casual observer, a Gutenberg Bible might look like it had been written by hand. But it had not been. It had been printed, which meant it could be reproduced. In the time it would have taken one scribe to copy the Bible once by hand, Gutenberg's press could produce dozens or even hundreds of copies. This was revolutionary. Word of Gutenberg's invention spread quickly. Within a few decades, printing presses were established in dozens of European cities: Rome, Venice, Paris, London, and many others. By the year 15, less than 50 years after Gutenberg printed his Bible, there were more than 1,000 printing presses in Europe, and they had produced approximately 20 million books. This is an astonishing number when you consider that, before printing, the total number of books in all of Europe probably numbered in the thousands at most. The impact of this explosion of printed material cannot be overstated. Books became cheaper and more available. Ideas spread faster. Literacy increased. The Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517 when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, might not have been possible without the printing press. Luther's ideas were printed and distributed throughout Europe in a matter of weeks. His German translation of the Bible could be owned by ordinary people, not just priests and scholars. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was also enabled by printing. Scientists like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton could publish their discoveries, and other scientists could read, critique, and build upon those discoveries. Scientific knowledge became cumulative in a way it had never been before. But all of this transformation of European and eventually world civilization depended on one thing: paper. Without cheap, abundant paper, printing would not have been economically viable. The printing press and paper were partners in revolution, each making the other more powerful. And the demand for paper exploded. Part 6. The Paper Hunger. By the 16th century, Europe's appetite for paper seemed insatiable. Printers needed vast quantities. A single book printing might require hundreds or thousands of sheets. Governments needed paper for bureaucratic records. Merchants needed paper for accounting and correspondence. Individuals wanted paper for letters and personal use. European papermakers struggled to keep up with demand. Paper was still made by hand using techniques that had changed little since medieval times. Rags, old cloth made of linen or cotton, were collected and sorted. The rags were cut into small pieces and left to rot for several weeks. Then they were washed and beaten in water-powered mills until they broke down into a pulp. The pulp was mixed with water, and a papermaker would dip a wire screen into the mixture, lifting out a thin layer of pulp that would dry into a sheet of paper. Each sheet was made individually by hand. This process required significant labor and resources. Rags were the main raw material, and there were never enough of them. Rag collectors traveled from town to town, buying old clothes and linens. In some places, laws were passed requiring people to save their rags for paper production. Despite these efforts, rag shortages were common. Papermakers experimented with other materials. Could paper be made from wood, which was abundant in European forests? Wood contains fibers similar to those in rags, but it also contains lignin, a compound that makes wood stiff and brown. Early experiments with wood pulp produced paper that was weak and discolored. Some papermakers tried unusual materials. In the 17th century, there were experiments with making paper from wasp nests. Since wasps make a paper-like material for their nests, there were proposals to use straw, grass, and even manure. None of these alternatives proved practical with the technology of the time. So paper remained dependent on rags, and demand continued to outstrip supply. Prices fluctuated based on rag availability. Wars, which destroyed property and increased demand for paper, for military orders and documents, often led to severe paper shortages. The situation was frustrating for everyone. Printers wanted more paper. Writers and scholars wanted more books. Governments wanted better record-keeping. But the technology of papermaking remained limited by manual labor and material constraints. What the paper industry needed was mechanization and a new source of fiber. And in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, both of these needs would be met. Part 7. The Industrial Revolution. The first great breakthrough in papermaking came with mechanization. For centuries, every sheet of paper had been made by hand, one at a time. This was slow and limited production. In the 1790s, a French papermaker named Nicolas Louis Robert invented a machine that could make continuous rolls of paper. His design used a moving wire mesh belt. Pulp was poured onto one end of the belt, and as the belt moved, water drained through the mesh, leaving behind a continuous web of paper. At the other end of the belt, the paper could be cut into sheets or rolled up. Robert's machine was revolutionary in concept, but imperfect in execution. He struggled to find financial backing and to refine his design. Eventually, the rights to his invention were acquired by two English brothers, Henry and Celie Fordrinier. They improved the design significantly and built a larger, more practical machine. By 1803, they had a working paper machine that could produce paper faster and more consistently than any hand process. The Fordrinier machine, as it came to be known, transformed the paper industry. Instead of making paper sheet by sheet, a single machine could produce a continuous roll of paper, hundreds or thousands of feet long. The machine could run constantly, limited only by the supply of pulp and the need for occasional maintenance. Production rates increased by orders of magnitude. Other inventors made further improvements. Steam engines were added to power the machines. Heated rollers were developed to dry the paper more quickly. By the mid-19th century, industrial paper mills could produce in a day what would have taken months or years by hand. But mechanization alone was not enough. Europe and North America still faced a rag shortage. The population was growing, and so was literacy. The demand for paper was growing faster than the supply of rags. The second great breakthrough came with the development of wood pulp paper. For centuries, papermakers had known that wood contains fibers similar to cloth fibers, but they had not been able to process wood effectively. In the 1840s, several inventors in Germany and Canada independently developed methods for turning wood into paper pulp. The key was to grind or chemically treat the wood to separate the fibers and remove or neutralize the lignin. Friedrich Gottlob Keller in Germany and Charles Finnerty in Canada are both credited with developing mechanical pulping processes around 1843–1844. They ground wood against rotating stones, breaking down the fibers while mixing them with water. The resulting pulp could be used to make paper. A few years later, other inventors developed chemical pulping processes. Wood chips were cooked in chemicals that dissolved the lignin and left the cellulose fibers intact. This produced a higher quality pulp that could be used for stronger, whiter paper. Wood pulp paper was cheaper than rag paper and could be produced in essentially unlimited quantities. Forests could be harvested and replanted. A single tree could provide enough fiber for thousands of sheets of paper. This solved the raw material problem that had constrained paper production for centuries. But early wood pulp paper had problems. It was not as strong or as durable as rag paper. The lignin in wood, if not fully removed, caused the paper to yellow and deteriorate over time. This is why newspapers from the 19th and early 20th centuries are often brown and brittle today. They were made from low-quality wood pulp that was not chemically treated to remove lignin. Over time, papermakers learned to improve wood pulp paper. Better chemical treatments removed more lignin. Stronger fibers could be selected. Paper could be coated and treated to improve its properties. By the late 19th century, wood pulp paper was good enough for most purposes. Rag paper was still used for important documents and high-quality books, but the vast majority of paper produced was now made from wood. This industrial transformation of papermaking came at exactly the right moment historically. The 19th century was a time of rapid social and technological change. The Industrial Revolution was transforming economies and societies. Populations were growing and urbanizing. Democratic movements were demanding wider participation in government, which required an informed citizenry. Scientific and technological advances were accelerating. All of these trends increased the demand for paper, and industrial papermaking met that demand. Part 8: The Age of Mass Communication. Imagine the world in the year 18. If you wanted to communicate with someone far away, you wrote a letter by hand. That letter traveled by horse or ship, taking days, weeks, or even months to arrive. If you wanted to know what was happening in the world, you might read a newspaper, but newspapers were expensive and came out only occasionally. Most information traveled slowly and reached only a small portion of the population. Now imagine the world in the year 19. You could write a letter and mail it with confidence that it would arrive within days, even across long distances. Newspapers were published daily in nearly every city and could be purchased cheaply. Magazines provided commentary and entertainment. Books were affordable and covered every conceivable topic. If you were literate, which an increasing percentage of the population was, you had access to more information than any king or scholar had possessed a century earlier. This transformation was made possible by cheap, abundant paper. Newspapers flourished in the 19th century. At the beginning of the century, newspapers were expensive and primarily read by the wealthy and educated. By the end of the century, cheap penny papers were available to almost anyone. Circulation numbers soared into the hundreds of thousands, and even millions. The New York World, published by Joseph Pulitzer, had a daily circulation of over 1 million copies by the 1890s. These newspapers shaped public opinion. They covered politics, crime, entertainment, and sports. They published investigative journalism that exposed corruption and social problems. They printed advertisements that informed people about products and services. They created a shared public discourse where citizens across a nation could read about and discuss the same events and issues. This had profound political implications. Democracy requires informed citizens. When only a tiny elite had access to information, democracy was limited. But when newspapers and books became cheap and widely available, more people could participate meaningfully in political life. This does not mean that everyone suddenly became politically engaged or that media was always responsible, but it created the possibility for broader participation. The expansion of education was another consequence of cheap paper. In the early 19th century, education was a privilege of the wealthy. Most children, especially in rural areas, received little or no formal schooling. But as countries industrialized, they needed a more educated workforce. Public education systems were established, and these systems required vast quantities of paper. Textbooks had to be printed for millions of students. Students needed paper for writing assignments. Teachers needed paper for lesson plans and record keeping. The entire enterprise of mass education depended on cheap paper. It is hard to imagine universal education without it. Science and technology advanced rapidly in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and this too was enabled by paper. Scientists published their findings in journals that were distributed around the world. Other scientists could read these journals, replicate experiments, and build on previous work. The pace of scientific discovery accelerated because knowledge could be shared quickly and widely. Technical knowledge also spread through paper. Engineers could consult published specifications and designs. Farmers could read agricultural bulletins. Mechanics could study repair manuals. The diffusion of practical knowledge improved productivity and quality of life across society. Books, of course, continued to be important. The 19th century was a golden age of literature. Dickens, Tolstoy, Twain, Austen, and countless others wrote novels that were read by millions. Poetry, history, philosophy, and travel writing flourished. Public libraries were established in many cities, making books available even to those who could not afford to buy them. Reading became a mass activity. In the evening, families would gather to read aloud. On trains and streetcars, people read newspapers and books. Reading was not just for scholars anymore. It was a common pastime. All of this transformation in how people communicated, learned, and thought, rested on the foundation of cheap paper. Paper was so ubiquitous that people took it for granted. They did not think about how extraordinary it was that they could buy a newspaper for a penny, or send a letter across the country for a few cents. They did not think about the complex industrial system that produced millions of tons of paper each year. But that system, invisible though it was to most people, was shaping the modern world. Part 9. Paper in the Modern World. The 20th century brought new uses for paper and new challenges to paper's dominance. At the beginning of the century, paper seemed more important than ever. 2 world wars generated enormous demand for paper. Maps, military orders, propaganda posters. ration books, letters from soldiers. Governments used paper to mobilize entire populations. The post-war period saw continued growth in paper consumption. Offices used paper for everything: letters, memos, reports, invoices, contracts. The photocopier, invented in the 1950s and widely adopted in the 1960s and 70s, made it easy to create copies of documents, which paradoxically increased paper usage rather than reducing it. People made copies of copies, filed multiple versions, distributed documents widely. Packaging became a major use of paper. Cardboard boxes, paper bags, wrapping paper, and other paper-based packaging materials were used to ship and protect goods. Supermarkets relied on paper packaging. The growth of consumer culture and global trade increased the demand for packaging materials. Paper also became important for personal and artistic purposes. Artists used paper for drawing, painting, and printmaking. Children used paper for school projects. People used paper for greeting cards, invitations, and personal notes. Paper was everywhere, in forms so varied that it was hard to remember that all of these uses descended from Cai Lun's innovation nearly 2,000 years earlier. But even as paper use reached its peak in the late 20th century, a challenge was emerging. Computers, which had been developed for military and scientific purposes in the mid-20th century, began to enter offices and homes in the 1970s and 80s. Some predicted that computers would lead to a paperless office. Information could be stored digitally, they said. Documents could be shared electronically. Paper would become obsolete. These predictions were premature. The digital revolution did change how we use paper, but it did not eliminate paper. In fact, global paper production continued to increase through the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. People printed emails. They printed web pages. They printed documents from computers to file in physical folders. What has changed, especially in the last 2 decades, is the shift toward digital alternatives for some uses of paper. E-books have reduced, though not eliminated, the printing of physical books. Online news has reduced newspaper circulation. Email has largely replaced personal letters. Digital signatures and storage have begun to reduce paper in some business contexts. But paper persists. Physical books remain popular, especially for certain types of reading. Many people prefer the tactile experience of paper to reading on screens. Paper is still used extensively in education. Legal documents are often still printed. Packaging, which is hard to replace with digital alternatives, continues to account for a large portion of paper use. There are also environmental concerns about both paper and its alternatives. Paper production requires cutting trees, using water and energy, and managing waste. While paper is biodegradable and recyclable, and while many forests are sustainably managed, there are legitimate environmental costs. On the other hand, digital alternatives also have environmental impacts. Servers consume energy, electronic devices contain toxic materials, and the digital infrastructure has a significant carbon footprint. The future of paper is uncertain. We are in a transition period where both physical and digital media coexist. Some uses of paper will likely continue for many decades, or even centuries. The feel and smell of a paper book, the convenience of a paper notebook, the beauty of a handwritten letter. These have qualities that digital media cannot quite replicate, but other uses of paper may continue to decline. It is unlikely that printed newspapers will ever regain their mid-20th century dominance. Office paper use may decline as digital document management improves. Certain types of packaging may be replaced by reusable containers or alternative materials. What seems certain is that paper, in some form, will remain with us for a long time. It is too useful, too versatile, and too deeply embedded in human culture to disappear completely. Part 10. The Legacy of Paper. Let us return to where we began, with Cai Lun, standing in the palace of Emperor He, holding in his hands a sheet of paper. Cai Lun died around the year 121 CE. Historical records say that he was implicated in a palace intrigue and, facing arrest, drank poison. His personal fate was tragic, but his legacy was secure. The Chinese continue to honor him as the inventor of paper, and his name is remembered today, more than 18 centuries later. But more important than Cai Lun, the man is what his invention made possible. Paper allowed civilizations to preserve knowledge across generations. Before paper, before writing itself, every generation had to relearn what previous generations had known. Knowledge was transmitted orally, which meant it was fragile, subject to forgetting and distortion. Writing changed this, and paper made writing practical and widespread. Think of what has been preserved on paper. The scientific discoveries of Islamic scholars in the medieval period. The mathematical theorems of ancient Greece, which survived in Arabic translations and were later translated into Latin, and spread throughout Europe. The plays of Shakespeare, the novels of Austen and Tolstoy, the poetry of Rumi and Basho, the letters of ordinary people, which give us glimpses into the past that official histories miss. Think of what paper enabled. The Protestant Reformation, which challenged religious authority and ultimately led to greater religious diversity and freedom. The Enlightenment, which emphasized reason and individual rights. The Scientific Revolution, which gave us our modern understanding of the natural world. The democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, which established the principle that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. None of these movements depended solely on paper, of course. They were driven by human ideas and actions. But paper was the medium through which ideas spread. It was the technology that allowed one person's thoughts to reach thousands or millions of others. It was the memory of civilization. Empires have risen and fallen. Rome fell more than 1,500 years ago, but we can still read the words of Roman writers. The Tang Dynasty of China collapsed over 1,000 years ago, but we can still read Tang poetry. The Abbasid Caliphate ended in 1258 when the Mongols sacked Baghdad. But the scientific and philosophical works of the Islamic Golden Age survived. Paper remembered them all. And paper has recorded not just the grand narratives of empires and wars, but also the small, personal moments that make up human life. Love letters, diaries, shopping lists, recipes handed down through families, children's drawings, birthday cards. These everyday uses of paper might seem trivial, but they are not. They are the texture of lived experience. They connect us to people who came before us and to the lives they lived. In my research for this script, I came across a story that captures paper's dual nature as both monumental and mundane. In the 1940s, during World War II, a young American soldier wrote letters home to his family. His letters described his training, his fears, his hope that the war would end soon. He wrote about missing his mother's cooking and wondering about his younger brother's progress in school. These letters were ordinary in content, but precious to his family. They arrived irregularly, sometimes weeks apart, and each one was read and reread, treasured as proof that he was still alive. The soldier survived the war and returned home. The letters were kept in a box in an attic. Decades later, his grandchildren found them and read them, getting a glimpse of their grandfather as a young man, scared and brave, far from home. Those fragile pieces of paper, written hastily in training camps and on troop ships, became a bridge across generations. This is what paper does. It bridges time and space. It makes the distant present and the past accessible. It is a tool for emperors and scholars, but also for ordinary people trying to communicate, to remember, to be remembered. As we move further into the digital age, it is worth reflecting on what we might lose if paper disappears entirely. Digital storage is convenient and powerful, but it is also fragile in ways we do not fully appreciate. Computers crash. File formats become obsolete. Websites disappear. We trust our memories and our history to systems that require continuous energy and maintenance. If our civilization were to collapse, what would survive? Could archaeologists 1,000 years from now recover our digital records? Or would they find only plastic and metal, silent and unreadable? Paper, by contrast, is robust. It requires no energy to maintain. It can be read by anyone with eyes, requiring no special device or password. Ancient paper documents have survived for centuries. We can hold in our hands a page written 500 years ago and read it directly, without mediation. This is not to romanticize paper or to deny its limitations. Paper can burn, decay, or be destroyed. Digital media has its own advantages. But paper's physicality, its tangibility, is valuable. It grounds us in the material world. It reminds us that information is not just abstract data, but something that exists in physical form. Let us imagine, for a moment, a world without paper. It is difficult to do because paper is so fundamental to how we live and think. A world without paper would have been a world without the European Renaissance, without the scientific revolution, without mass education, without modern democracy. These developments were not caused by paper alone, but paper was a necessary condition for them. It was the infrastructure on which these movements were built. Even today, in our digital age, paper remains important. Yes, we read news online. Yes, we send emails instead of letters. Yes, we store documents in the cloud. But we still print photos to put on our walls. We still give paper greeting cards. We still write in notebooks. We still read physical books, especially when we want to focus deeply or when we want an aesthetic experience. Paper has adapted to each new challenge. When the printing press was invented, scribes feared for their jobs, but paper production increased. When computers were invented, some predicted the end of paper, but paper found new uses. Paper is resilient because it is versatile and because it meets human needs that go beyond mere information storage. There is something profound about the fact that the same basic material made from plant fibers suspended in water and dried into sheets has served humanity for nearly 2,000 years. The paper Cai Lun made in 105 CE was not fundamentally different from the paper produced today. Modern paper is made more efficiently and with more consistent quality, but the principle is the same. This continuity across centuries and across cultures is remarkable. Paper spread from China to Korea to Japan to Central Asia to the Islamic world to Europe to the Americas. Each culture adapted paper to its own needs and aesthetics, but the basic technology remained recognizable. This suggests that paper meets a deep human need, a need to record and to communicate that transcends particular cultures or historical periods. What is that need? It is, perhaps, the need to extend ourselves beyond our physical and temporal limits. A thought exists only in one mind, for as long as that mind lives. A spoken word exists only for a moment, heard by those within earshot. But a written word can travel across continents and survive for centuries. It can be read by people the writer never met, in times and places the writer never imagined. Paper made this extension of self possible on a mass scale. Before paper, writing was rare and precious. After paper, writing became common. This democratization of the written word changed what it means to be human. It allowed more people to participate in the great conversation of civilization. It allowed ideas to spread and to collide with other ideas, creating new syntheses and new understandings. There is a Buddhist saying, "When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Paper appeared at different times in different places, but always when the conditions were right. In China, it appeared when the empire needed a more efficient way to administer its vast territories. In the Islamic world, it appeared just as scholarship was flourishing and needed a way to record and disseminate knowledge. In Europe, it appeared just before the printing press would make mass production of books possible. This timing was not miraculous or mystical. It was the result of human ingenuity responding to human needs. Paper spread because it was useful. It was adopted because it solved problems. It persisted because it continued to meet needs even as those needs changed over time. But there is still something almost magical about paper when you think about it. You take plants, trees, old cloth, things that would otherwise rot or be discarded. You break them down into fibers, mix them with water, spread them thin, and dry them. What you get is a material that can preserve thoughts across centuries, that can carry messages across continents, that can educate children and record laws and tell stories that move the human heart. From rags and trees and water, we create memory. From physical matter, we create something that transcends the physical, meaning knowledge, culture. Cai Lun could not have imagined where his invention would lead. He could not have foreseen Islamic scholars in Baghdad preserving Greek philosophy, or Gutenberg printing Bibles in Germany, or newspapers in 19th century America, shaping public opinion, or students today in schools around the world, learning from textbooks, printed on paper made from wood pulp. But he knew he had created something valuable. He knew that his emperor could use it. He knew that it was better than bamboo or silk. And he was right. In honoring Cai Lun, we honor not just one man, but the human capacity for innovation. We honor the countless papermakers, scribes, printers, writers, and readers who used paper to build civilization. We honor the material itself, humble and ubiquitous, soft and strong, which has carried the weight of human thought for nearly 2 millennia. Empires rise and fall, paper remembers them all. This was true in Cai Lun's time. It remained true through the ages of Islamic scholarship, European printing, and modern mass media. And it remains true today, even as we navigate the transition to digital media. Paper has been our faithful companion through history. It has recorded our triumphs and our tragedies, our wisdom and our foolishness. It has given permanence to the impermanent thoughts of mortal beings. It has allowed each generation to learn from those who came before and to leave something for those who will come after. In the end, paper is more than a technology or a commodity. It is a testament to human creativity and to our desire to communicate across the barriers of time and space. It is, in the most literal sense, the medium through which we have recorded civilization. And for that, we owe a debt to a man who lived 1800 years ago, who experimented with tree bark and old rags, who stood before an emperor with a sheet of paper in his hands, and who changed the world. The soft invention. The material that bends but does not break. The surface on which we write our history. Paper. Epilogue. A personal reflection. As I close this history of paper, I find myself looking at the paper around me. Books on my shelf. A notebook on my desk. A letter from a friend tucked into a drawer. Each of these pieces of paper carries something. A story. An idea. A memory. In our rush toward the digital, we sometimes forget the value of the physical. We forget that an old letter, yellowed with age, carries not just the words written on it, but the physical trace of the person who wrote it. We forget that a book passed down through a family carries not just its printed text, but the marginalia, the dog-eared pages, the coffee stains that mark how it was read and loved. Paper ages with us. It becomes part of our lives in a way that digital files, abstract and weightless, do not. This is not a judgment against digital media, which has its own strengths. But it is a reminder that paper offers something unique and valuable. As we think about the future, we should not be too hasty to abandon paper. We should preserve the knowledge and skills of papermaking. We should continue to produce and use paper thoughtfully, sustainably, appreciating what it offers. We should teach future generations not just how to use digital devices, but also how to write by hand, how to appreciate the feel of a physical book, how to understand the history and meaning of this remarkable material. Because paper is not just a technology of the past. It is part of our present and, I believe, will remain part of our future. It connects us to our ancestors, who wrote on bamboo and parchment and early paper, struggling to record their thoughts and preserve their knowledge. It connects us to each other, through the books we share and the notes we write. And it will connect us to those who come after, who may hold in their hands something we wrote, on paper, and feel that connection across time. Empires rise and fall. Technologies come and go. But some things endure. Paper has endured for nearly 2,000 years. With care and appreciation, it can endure for many more. And with that thought, I set down my pen, on paper, and rest.